Not many people get murdered when they're at work. Some people die while they're at work. There were 138 workers killed in work-related accidents in the UK in 2023-24, but not many get murdered there. Picture the scene. You've gone to work, it's Friday night. You're working the late shift. It's the end of the working week. All you want to do is get through your tasks, get home to your wife, your daughter, and just have a nice Friday night. But for one man in August 1952, that Friday night shift would be his last. Geoffrey Charles Dean was 28 years old during the time of this story, and he was a working class man. Some people knew him more commonly as Dixie, and he actually served in Norway during the Second World War in a paratroop regiment. After leaving the armed forces, he got a job working at Ash Vale railway station. One of his tasks was to count the cash at the end of each working day and put it away securely in the safe in the booking office. This was 1952, remember. Cash was king back then, or should I say queen, because a year after this story, Queen Elizabeth II had her coronation. Living in a modest flat with his wife, his daughter and his unborn child they were expecting, Geoffrey, as I said, worked hard for a living, he paid his way, and he always put his family first. The flat was based in sort of a country house called Elstow in the village of Ash, just a couple of miles north of Ash Vale. Friday, August 22nd, 1952 was a typical evening at Ash Vale railway station. The clock was headed for 8 p.m, that's when it closed, and the cash was being counted and ready to be put in the safe as per the usual procedure. Whenever it got to 8 o'clock, the tickets could no longer be purchased from the booking office. Those duties were shifted onto the platform. Now, Geoffrey was working late that night. He said he was going to do this. It wasn't exactly out of the ordinary. He was going to stay late and catch up on some accounting that needed doing. Probably because it was Friday, heading towards the weekend. It needed doing, and he often put his hand up and volunteered to do, I don't suppose you could call it overtime, but it probably curried favour with his gaffer. At 7:45, he handed the tickets and date stamps over to the senior porter in preparation from the tickets being moved from the booking office to the waiting room on the platform. He did remind the senior porter that he was working late. The last thing he wanted was for the guy to walk past and think, "What on earth are you doing here?" The sad reality was that just 1 hour after he handed the tickets and date stamps over, 8:45 p.m, Geoffrey was already dead. He'd been stabbed to death by an unknown assailant, receiving 20 wounds in the process. The motive? More than likely, money. A reported £160 was taken from the safe inside the booking office. It's worth around £3,900 in today's money. If we rewind a little bit, probably just after 8 o'clock when the booking office had closed, a soldier was walking through Ash Vale station. He wanted a ticket, but was frustrated because the booking office was shut, so he starts banging on the shutters. Not gaining a response, he probably put his ear to it, and he said that he heard a couple of men's voices. Accompanying the voices were a series of footsteps. Now, he said this was a couple of men larking about, messing around, whatever turn of phrase you want to use. But he wanted a ticket. He wasn't concerned with these two men having a mess about, so he went in search of the porter to buy a ticket, and then he spotted the sign saying you have to buy a ticket from the waiting room on the platform, so that's where he headed. At 8:55 p.m, a junior porter was walking through the train station, and something caught his eye, something rather out of the ordinary. The light was on in the booking office. This was most unusual because Geoffrey should have finished his work by then. There was no logical reason for the light to still be on in the booking office. He always turned it off when he went home. Curiosity got the better of this junior porter, so he headed over to the booking office. It was still locked, and he peered inside the window. He climbed up onto a windowsill and looked in. The first thing he saw was a pair of legs lay motionless on the floor. Surrounding the legs was a large pool of blood. Not sure what else to do, the junior porter summoned the station master, who got there at about 9:20 p.m, just under half hour later. The station master managed to force open the door of the booking office, and inside he and the junior porter were greeted by the sight of Geoffrey Dean laying dead on the floor, covered in his own blood. Looking immediately to the safe, they realised it had been opened and there appeared to be some cash missing. Now, there were some other bits that were scattered around on the booking office floor, possibly deemed of insufficient value to the thief. There were a set of keys, a bit of paperwork, some other bits and bats, some coins in a bag, nothing really worth as much as that £160. The police were summoned and they arrived at about 10:15, and an inspection of the train station, especially the booking office, began immediately. The officers were joined by the British Transport Commission Police, and the first theory was that Geoffrey had been beaten over the head with what they described as being a cosh. Now, if you don't know what a cosh is, that's basically a truncheon, nightstick, baton, choose whichever word fits your nation here, a long, hard, dark, generally stick that's a very effective weapon. The thing was, they couldn't actually find or recover one of those weapons at the scene, which sort of put that theory to bed. Still, photographs were taken at the scene, they dusted for fingerprints, all the old techniques they used to use 70 years ago. They didn't have the luxury of the mod cons we have now for forensics. And speaking of which, when Geoffrey's post-mortem was completed, the true extent of his injuries was revealed. Pathologist Dr. Arthur Mant revealed there was a stab wound behind Geoffrey's right ear, which severed both the lingual artery and the jugular vein. He also had 9 stab wounds to his back, 7 to his chest, one of which pierced his breastbone and even penetrated his heart. That's how tremendous the force used was. He had further wounds to his face, arms, abdomen and legs. It was truly a brutal and violent attack, excessively so for the sake of £160. The main incident room for the investigation was set up at Ash Vale railway station, sort of acted as the hub, the headquarters, HQ if you will. GPO engineers installed a special telephone line so communications flowed seamlessly for the detectives. GPO is General Post Office. And following that, a methodical search begun. All the hotels, lodging houses, anywhere people may stay, bed and breakfast in the surrounding areas were all searched, and it was that which led to the capture of the man who killed Geoffrey Dean. On the morning of August 23rd, in the nearby town of Aldershot, a couple of officers visited a house that they knew regularly took in lodgers. Investigating one of the first-floor bedrooms, on the bed they discovered a blood-stained jacket. Reporting that finding back to HQ, they were told to stay put and arrest whoever came home later that night. A few hours later, at 11:16 p.m, in walked John James Alcott. He was immediately placed into custody. When the officers looked inside the jacket, they found a blood-stained passport, a blood-stained wallet, and 2 10-shilling treasury notes, which were also blood-stained. Alcott was escorted to Farnham Police Station, and when there, he was searched. He had a roll of £109 and 10 shilling, which he'd wrapped using an elastic band. That equates to just over £2,500 in today's money. His reply was, "That's some of the money." He then bizarrely confessed that he'd used a knife to kill Geoffrey and that he'd stored it in the chimney of the room he'd lodged. Officers quickly went back to the room and recovered the knife. It was exactly where Alcott said it would be. He'd bought this weapon on the day of the murder, along with the jacket, which I've already mentioned and that had been recovered, some grey trousers which were discarded in a nearby bush, they were later recovered also, and a pair of shoes that were with a cobbler. Now, if you know what a cobbler is, they repair shoes. I don't quite get that because he bought them on that day and then took them to the cobbler. Doesn't really explain that, but if they were new, they can't have been great. But who was this John James Alcott character? Well, he was known to his friends as Jimmy, and he had a bit of a turbulent upbringing, didn't have the best childhood. He was born and raised in Bexleyheath, southeast London, and he grew up with 3 children, it reported. Now, I'm assuming these were his siblings. It doesn't explicitly state that, but let's just assume that they were his 3 siblings. Growing up, his dad was never really there. He was busy serving for the army during World War II, so he was essentially raised by his mother alongside those 3 other children. It seemed that the lack of that paternal figure in his life shaped the boy and man he would become. By the age of 10, he was stealing bicycles. By the age of 11, he was stealing money. So bad was his behaviour that he ended up getting sent to an approved school for 3 years. Now, approved schools were a type of residential care for neglected or badly behaved boys from 1933 to 1973. Think of it as sort of a child prison, kind of, but not really. They just took in kids that the parents couldn't handle or that the law was sick and tired of dealing with. After leaving secondary school, Alcott joined the cadets, and then when he turned 18, he joined the Grenadier Guards. He was immediately posted to Germany for what's been called occupation duties. I'm not really sure what that is. But it was when he was in the army over there that he started to claim he experienced regular blackouts. In September 1948, Alcott suddenly went AWOL, absent without leave, from his camp in Germany. Heading out into the German countryside like he did so many times as a kid back in England, he met a refugee from what was known at the time as Czechoslovakia. Now, the two men agreed to carry on their journey together on foot, headed for France. That was their ultimate final destination. On the way, they stopped one evening at a lodging house. While there, they tried to steal a car, but they were caught by night watchman Peter Helm doing so. Shocked and not sure what to do, Alcott, and I assume his Czechoslovakia friend, started attacking Helm mercilessly, beating him with a fire extinguisher and a whiskey bottle. Leaving him for dead, they carried on their journey, but were caught just 2 days later. Reports had come in that Peter had died from his injuries. By January 1949, Alcott was 19, and he was tried by a general court-martial for the crime of what was ultimately murder. A general court-martial was the only military tribunal with the authority to pass a death sentence, so this was serious stuff. And you won't be surprised to learn that Alcott was found guilty. He was banged to rights. He killed the guy. He was therefore sentenced to be hanged. But he got away with it, believe it or not, thanks to a legal loophole. It was required by law to tell Alcott's parents that he'd been arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death, none of which happened. His parents were fuming at this and raised their concerns to the highest authority, which led to King George VI, who was in power at the time, pardoning Alcott, releasing him as a free man, and he returned back to civilian life in April of 1949. He got married, secured a job as a railway fireman at the Hither Green Depot, and appeared to be living a pretty standard life as everyone else was at the time in post-war Britain. The week leading up to Geoffrey's murder is where it all starts with Alcott on Monday, August 18, 1952. He was on annual leave at the time and he planned to go to France with his wife. He told her that morning he was off to get his holiday pay, so he walks out the house but never returns. Instead, he headed to Aldershot and Farnborough, staying in a hotel for the night. By the Wednesday, he'd made his first visit to Ash Vale railway station at 11 a.m. He'd inquired about the boat trains from Victoria Station in London to Dover, a rather random request. Dover is where you'd get the ferry across to Calais in France, and there is a boat train, the train to get the boat, from Victoria to Dover. Why he was asking about that at Ash Vale, possibly just a stalling technique so he could survey the staff and look at what was going on at the train station, knowing what he had in mind already. But for some reason he didn't stay at a hotel that night. Instead, he stayed in a shelter in Clapham. The next day, Thursday, August 21st, he returned to Ash Vale station at 6:30 in the morning, and he spent pretty much all day there lingering about as if he was a fake tourist or a traveller. He was asking random questions to the porters about railway linemen, proper weird questions that you sort of wouldn't expect from someone who's just catching a train. At one point, he was seen cleaning his fingernails with the knife that he'd bought. He said it were a gift for his nephew, but again, a very strange thing to see. Still, the porters thought nothing of it and didn't report it. He did leave the station briefly that day and returned at 5 p.m, this time flashing his railway worker's card to gain a bit of trust and asking to use the telephone inside the booking office. He faked a story about wanting to know about a fireman at Hither Green Depot. He rang his work. They said, basically, we don't know what you're talking about. We don't have any news for you. So he left, came back again in a couple of hours' time, asked if a message had been left for him. One hadn't. So then he just hung around talking to the booking office clerk till closing time at 8 p.m. All the while, he's surveying the staff, watching the cash management procedure, looking who's where, who works, what the shift patterns are, taking it all in preparation for what would happen the next day, the day of Geoffrey's murder, on Friday, August 22nd. He arrived that night at 6:30 p.m. and again asked to use the phone, stalling for time. The precise chain of events that led to Geoffrey's murder after that was known only by Alcott. Did he hide out in the booking office? Was he chatting to him until he closed and then killed him immediately? We will never know, but that was ultimately what happened. The evidence against him was pretty stark. There were 24 witnesses that came forward. They got the soldier. He reported to his commanding officer what had happened and he reported it to the police. You had bus operators, you had workmen, each of whom had come in contact with Alcott in that week leading up to the murder. But really, the thing that sealed his fate was his own admission of the crime and the evidence of the blood-stained everything back at the room and the knife and the clothes he'd discarded. The director of the Metropolitan Police Laboratory also went on to testify at the trial. Bloodstains found on the towel at the lodging house, the sheath of the knife and the jacket were all matched to Geoffrey because they were all type O blood. That's all they had to go on back then. No DNA. Matching a blood type was sufficient, and that was pretty much as bang to rights as you could get back then. On top of that, some fibres recovered from the knife closely matched this maroon pullover that Geoffrey was wearing on the night he was killed. With that, his trial was set and began on November 18th, 1952. It took place at Surrey Assizes with Mr. Justice Finnemore overseeing the proceedings. The only defence Alcott offered was that he'd suffered one of his infamous blackouts. He didn't remember a thing. He didn't actually remember travelling to Aldershot on the Monday. Even with that, the jury did not believe him. They found him guilty of murder. And back then, you know as well as I do, they didn't mess around. He was sentenced to death, with his execution taking place at Wandsworth Prison on January 2nd, 1953, less than 2 months after receiving his death sentence. Albert Pierrepoint was the executioner, if you're wondering. Now, the irony is, if Alcott had been hanged as he was supposed to for killing Peter Helm, then Geoffrey would have remained alive. He could have lived the rest of his life with his young family. Unfortunately, the decision to pardon Alcott left him free to take another innocent life. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story. That was Geoffrey Dean's murder from 1952 in Ash Vale. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to give it a like, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, all that good stuff. It does help get the show noticed. And I'll be back soon with another video. Cheerio.